Hello and welcome back to Hydroponics Daily. Today we're talking about pH. It's a miss of me to get over 150 episodes into a podcast about hydroponics and not have talked about pH, or certainly not dedicated a whole episode to it. So I'm making up for that now with this episode here. pH, going back to basics, if you missed sort of basic high school chemistry, is the measure of how acid or alkaline a substance is, a water-based solution or water. So any sort of water-based product or solution, it measures how acid or alkaline it is. pH actually is about the amount of hydrogen ions, H plus, in the water or in the solution, and that's why it's got pH. The capital H is for hydrogen. Nobody's actually 100% sure what pH stands for. Scientists don't know. Some have said potential hydrogen. I think the French puissance de hydrogen or something like this has been muted, but no one's really sure why it came about. But pH is what it is. And if it's pH 1, it's very acidic. And if it's pH 14, it's very alkaline. And so the reason it's important in hydroponics is not because when you think of acids and alkali, you think of them burning your face off, burning your skin off, like sulfuric acid or nitric acid, really dangerous chemicals. And then at the other end, sodium hydroxide, potassium hydroxide, products that are used in oven cleaner and things like this. So it's not about the actual damage caused to the tissues or anything like that. We're talking about pHs much more in the middle, govern nutrient availability. And that's the key thing you have to take away. When it comes to pH and plants, it's all about nutrient availability. If you get to the point where it's scorching the plants because it's too acid or too alkali, the plant's going to die straight away. So it's all about nutrient availability. And so the pH scale is logarithmic, which means that pH 6 is 10 times more acidic than pH 7, and pH 5 is 100 times more acidic than pH 7, pH 4 is 1,000 times. So what might seem like a tiny, tiny change can actually be a massive change in the amount of acidity. So it's we call a logarithmic scale, goes up in tens, and so the changes are dramatic. So if you had a nutrient solution that was 5, it's 100 times more acidic than pH 7. Now in hydroponics, there is a sweet spot, and that is 5.5 to 6.5. And in soils, you're around the same as well. So if you go in soils, you can listen to this episode and get good knowledge from it, because the same sort of things occur. There are other things that happen in soils that don't happen in hydroponics, but we're not going to go into those. So the reason 5.5 to 6.5 is the sweet spot, because in that range, all of the nutrients that the plant needs are soluble if put into water. Now, if you go outside of that, nutrients will start to fall out, and depending on what the pH is, it will affect that. And then some nutrients become extremely locked out and precipitate out. When I talk about precipitation, it's like the crystallization, the falling out of the nutrients. And once that happens, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to get them back into solution, even if you change the pH back to the sweet spot. So that's why it's crucial in hydroponics. So 5.5 to 6.5 is the sweet spot. You might even see people say 5.8 to 6.2 is the sweet spot. And I don't agree with that, because I think they're trying to get too dialed in. And the problem is, if you do that, if you're constantly trying to correct your pH, get it right into that 5.8 to 6.2, if you're constantly trying to get it into that very much smaller sweet spot, you're adding pH up, you're adding pH down, chemicals, and you're just increasing the salt levels in the solution, and you're wasting a lot of time and a lot of product as well. So you can actually harm the plant by messing around with pH too much. As long as you're in that 5.5 to 6.5, there will be enough of every single nutrient. And if you're seeing issues around nutrients, it'll be caused by things other than the pH of that. So that's the optimum. If you go below 5.5, then certain problems occur. Some nutrients might become too available, and that's not going to be a problem in hydroponics, because they're not being released from the soil. So you can get things like aluminium and iron toxicity at very low pH, but you're not going to get that in hydroponics because you're not using soil, so they're not going to be there to come out of. out of the soil and into solution. However, you will get lockout of calcium and magnesium. So that's where you'll start to see calcium deficiencies if your pH is too low. If you're seeing calcium deficiencies and you're in the sweet spot, then that'll just be because of lack of calcium or poor water management, high humidity, things like that. High pH, there you're going to get iron deficiency, manganese deficiency, zinc deficiency, but iron is the main one. All the others should occur much later on. You'd have to have very high iron levels for manganese or boron or phosphorus to be the first ones that you pick up. Normally it's going to be iron deficiency. So that's interveinal chlorosis on the younger leaves, and that's fairly easy to spot. So you'll get stunted growth and low growth, as well as these nutrient symptoms of nutrient deficiencies. How can you manage the pH in hydroponics? The first thing before you start messing around with chemicals is you need to monitor the pH. You can use test strips, so sort of indicator paper that you would use in school. I use these every now and again. They're very easy, but you really want to get a good quality pH pen, not a cheap and nasty one, a really good pH pen. You can get ones that have got integrated EC, electrical conductivity measurements in them, and measure it all around your system. So if you've got a recirculatory system, measure it in the gullies as well, just to make sure you're not missing anything. Monitor at least daily. And some systems, you can actually set them up so you can get constant monitoring of pH. We haven't got one at Utremus, it'd be nice to have. And then if you do try and adjust the pH, then adjust gradually. Don't try to do it all in one go, because adjusting water, things that are not buffered, like water, fertigation solution, they will change quickly and very difficult. So always try and dilute the pH up or the pH down first if you're struggling, because small changes will make a big difference. So just a few drops will make a big difference, and let your system run through continuously before you add more, because you don't want to have like localized buildups. You could add some pH up and it could get sucked into the system and then not come back again for 10 minutes. So do it really gradually. You're not in any rush here, especially if you're using silicon products to increase the pH. Then these will take a few hours at least to have their full effect. Silicon is not the main one that's used though. For pH up, it's phosphoric acid. Sorry, for pH down, it's phosphoric acid. And then pH up, it's potassium hydroxide. So potassium hydroxide, the same chemical that's in oven cleaner, so a hazardous, chemical, and pH down, phosphoric acid, again, dangerous. So they're the ones that are sold in grow shops. You will see in commercial greenhouses, especially NFT, nitric acid being used, because they like to add extra nitrogen for tomatoes and cucumbers and things like this, which is a good option. Works effectively, and it's adding, nitrogen nutrition rather than phosphorus nutrition. Big problem with what nitric acid it does. It's extremely toxic. It will, if you expose your workers to it, and the fumes can be extremely hazardous as well for nitric acid. Same for hydrochloric acid. So nitric acid, I've seen kids in the Lee Valley in Essex playing football around IBCs, big totes of nitric acid near the greenhouses. And they could have opened one of the valves just messing around, and the nitric acid could have spilled out, and they could have absolutely just, burn their skin off, burn the bones off, burn the muscle off. Shocking. You see some sites when you go around commercial hydroponics glass houses. It's supposed to be state of the art, but that's shocking, really. So don't use nitric acid unless you really have to. Never use hydrochloric acid, because it's adding chlorine, and chlorine is toxic in anything other than minimal levels. What else can you use? You can use citric acid. That's a good organic pH down. That's used in a lot of organic systems. Just because it's organic doesn't mean it's not powerful. Citric acid is very powerful. An acid, we use it in a lot of products, and it comes in crystalline form, or you can buy it in a 50% solution or weaker. It does add carbon to the system though, and microbes can grow in carbon. So if you wanted a completely sterile system, you'd either use phosphoric acid or nitric acid if you're a large grower. You can get automatic dosing systems, as I say, that can dose in these pH up and pH down. If you're using gold leaf or liquid gold, as it's called in the UK, our product, then you don't need to worry about pH adjustment, because it drags the pH back to the sweet spot every time. Even if you're adding a really alkaline seaweed extract or a really acid growth stimulant, something like that, if your water's hard or soft, it would just drag it back. So one of the great things about gold leaf and liquid gold is that you don't need to bother with pH, and also you don't need to bother with these really hazardous chemicals that adjust the pH up and the pH down. And a lot of people grow hydroponics at home, and if you've got kids running around, you don't want the bottles of pH up and pH down, especially, you might misplace them, you might mislabel them. It's not cool. And like that greenhouse with the kids running around the IBC of nitric acid, I hear some absolute horror stories of kids getting harmed, even killed on farms, and I would do everything to avoid using nitric acid around kids. Hard tap water with high alkalinity can buffer your system towards a high pH. So you might want to also consider RO water, because your pH will always be rising when you've got that hard alkaline product with lots of carbonate in the water. So you'll get that drift back towards a high pH. DWC seems to be the one that pH is a real issue with, and pH control you can get because of the aeration in NFT and DWC. You can get sort of drift up, and a lot of people will either use a lot of pH up or a lot of pH down, depending on their system and how they grow. You tend to find you only end using one or the other. It depends on the crop as well. Some crops are exuding either hydroxide or hydrogen ions into the water, depending on how they absorb nutrients, especially things like nitrogen. Plants can absorb nitrogen in a number of different ways. And if they absorb it in certain ways, they can either push out things that alkali the solution or acidify the solution. So it depends on your crop, which one you'll find you'll be using one more than the other over time. Some interesting quirks about pH. If you're growing hydrangeas and you have a high pH, the flowers turn pink. And if you have a low pH of the growing solution or the soil, then the flowers go bright blue. And that's because the anthocyanin pigments in the petals attach to aluminium ions below pH 5.5, and that changes the pigment to blue. So depending on which one you like, you could adjust the pH. So I like red ones, but a lot of people like blue ones. So yeah, if you ever seen those, it's only certain types. It's the mop head hydrangea, Hydrangea macrophylla, and mountain hydrangeas, Hydrangea serrata. But they grow a lot in the Wirral near Liverpool, and you often see the bright blue hydrangeas there, and that's because of the aluminium attaching to the pH in those acidic soils. So interesting fact that's going to be of no use to anyone apart from hydrangea growers. Also, if you're using elemental sulfur, burning elemental sulfur in your greenhouse or your grow room, be careful, because that rains down sulfuric acid on your plants. So you will see a drop in pH dramatically if you're using sulfur to control pests and disease. People think of it as this organic, natural product. Even if you're putting powdered sulfur on your growing media, it'll break down to sulfuric acid by the microbes in the growing media. So always be careful that you're using any elemental sulfur, whether you're burning it or spraying it or using it and mixing it into growing media. Always be careful, because that is going to drop your pH dramatically, and it's not good for your health either. If you're using poor quality mineral wool, that can raise the pH up, probably due to limestone in the material that's being used. So always soak and rinse rock wool before planting. If you do get precipitation of nutrients out because the pH is not optimized, these can clog up the roots, around the roots, or more dangerously, they can block filters and drippers. And if that happens, then you can get a buildup of pressure, or worst case scenario, your system doesn't drain back into the tank and you can get a flood. So you need to be careful. And that normally happens at high pH, but it can also happen at lower pH as well. So just keep an eye on that. You can get the release of, so we say, toxic elements as well, so like aluminium, but also heavy metals. So if you've got a really extreme pH, even if you're so don't use things like bleach to clean any material unless it's absolutely safe. You can use alkaline material on that when you're cleaning your system out. You may be growing a plant that likes acidic conditions, in which case you might lower the pH just below 5.5, but still not below 4.5. These plants are called ericaceous because most of them belong to the Ericaceae family, the Erica, the heather family, so things like rhododendrons, azaleas. There are other plants in other families that are also classed as ericaceous. And so that's what gardeners call them, ericaceous. The actual technical term for them is calcifuges, or refugees from calcium, the way I remember it. So calcium we think of as being high pH. So calcifuges, and then plants that like calcium and high pH are calcicoles. And calcicoles are things like brassicas and many meadow orchids. So you've got your calcifuges that like acidic conditions and your calcicoles. If your plant's one of these, then you might go on the upper end or the lower end of the sweet spot that's normally used for hydroponics. The vast majority of plants are not calcicoles and calcifuges. As I said, the plants, the way they absorb different forms of nitrogen can affect the pH of the fertigation solution, and that's why it's always good to have the correct balance of different forms of nitrogen in the base fertilizers. A lot of hydroponic fertilizers that are new often fail in this, and they can cause dramatic shifts in pH. So if you look at gold leaf, or as it's called in the UK, liquid gold, there's a good balance of nitrate and ammonia forms of nitrogen so that they are absorbed in the right balance, and so that the nitrogen doesn't dramatically change the pH. So another reason to use that product if you're new to hydroponics or you want to produce a really clean, good, high yield and grow. Definitely recommend gold leaf if you're in the US, and then liquid gold, which we've launched this year in the UK. If you're outside of those countries, then give us a shout. I'm sure we could find a way to get that product to you. And we're always looking for distributors outside of the US and the UK. We do sell the product into Australia under a different brand name. If you want to know what that brand name is, just give us a contact and we can let you know. That's been Hydroponics Daily for today. All about pH. If you think I've got anything wrong, let me know. And probably not the last time we'll revisit pH because it's so important in hydroponics. It's one of those things you really need to get dialed in. It's really easy to do that. It's very easy to monitor. pH pens are really affordable. And once you get it going, you should be producing really good crops. So until tomorrow, that's been Hydroponics Daily. Thank you very much for listening.